Imagine the impossible. A child declared dead not once, but 3 times, who miraculously comes back to life. However, when he opens his eyes, he is not just a survivor. It brings with it a deep message, full of mystery and meaning, as if it came from a place beyond our understanding. A look at a plan that many believe exists, but few dare to imagine. This is the extraordinary story of Landon Whitley, a child who crossed the boundaries between life and death, crossed the unknown, and returned with a story that defies logic and transcends reason. Landon claims to have seen Jesus, and what he heard and felt, there is something that can change the way we see life and death. This is not just a survival story. It is a call to all those who have wondered about the existence of something beyond this world. It all started on a normal Sunday in 1997, a sunny day that promised to be like so many others for the Whitley family. Julie and Andy, loving and dedicated parents, had a special routine on Sundays. They went to church in the morning and returned home to have lunch with the family and enjoy a quiet day. That day, in the back seat of the car, Landon, only 8 years old, looked out the window, distracted and unaware of what was about to happen. The sun was shining brightly, filling the inside of the car with a golden light that made life seem safe and full of promises. But in a matter of seconds, that serenity was violently interrupted. An ambulance, advancing at high speed, crossed his path at an intersection. Andy tried to react, but the impact was inevitable and devastating. The family's car was thrown like a toy, spinning uncontrollably, the deafening sound of metal twisting and glass brushing resounding in the air. When the vehicle finally stopped, everything seemed frozen in time. The silence that followed was as overwhelming as the chaos that preceded it, interrupted only by the sound of the sirens approaching quickly. Andy Whitley lost his life in the impact, leaving Julie seriously injured and trapped in the hardware. But it was Landon who was in the most critical state. When the rescuers found him, he was not breathing. His small body was inert, and the paramedics, aware of the seriousness of the situation, fought against the clock to keep him alive. Upon arriving at the hospital, Landon was declared clinically dead. The doctors did everything in their power, but the child's heart stopped beating twice more during emergency procedures. With each interruption, it seemed that he was being dragged to a place beyond this world, only to be returned by a miracle. Julie, while struggling to survive her own injuries and the crushing mourning for the loss of her husband, refused to give up her son. She prayed fervently, begging God not to take Landon away from her. Despite the gloomy statistics and predictions, Julie had an unwavering certainty. The spirit of the child she loved was still there, waiting to return. But no one could predict that Landon would not only survive, but also return with a message that would shake everything we know about life, death, and what awaits us beyond them. The days turned into weeks while Landon remained in a coma, motionless, connected to machines that kept his body alive. Julie, his mother, didn't go to his side. With her heart torn by the loss of her husband and the uncertainty about her son's future, she spent hours holding his little hand, as if the simple touch could bring him back from the abyss. The doctors, although dedicated, did not hide their skepticism. For them, Landon was another of the many tragic stories that ended in gloomy endings. They had seen many patients in similar situations and knew that the chances of recovery were almost non-existent. However, something in Landon's case was different, something inexplicable. While his body remained inert in the hospital bed, his soul seemed to be elsewhere, away from the cold glow of the fluorescent lamps and the rhythmic sound of the machines. Later, Landon would describe this experience as something that human words could never translate. He had left the hospital, had left his body, and had found himself in such a sublime place that it seemed unreal, but it was more true and vivid than anything he had known. Landon knew, with absolute clarity, that he had crossed the gates of heaven. He remembered walking along paths paved with pure gold, bright as if the light emanated from within. The air around him was warm, soft, and impregnated with unconditional love. There was no sun, but the whole place was bathed in a light that seemed to come from everywhere, as if the space itself was made of divine energy. Every color, every sound was amplified. There was a heavenly harmony that enveloped his soul and made him feel an indescribable peace. As he walked through this divine kingdom, he saw figures wrapped in a golden glow. At first glance, they were unknown faces, but he felt an inexplicable connection with them, as if they were part of his story in some way. He soon realized that those figures were relatives who had left long before he was born. Despite never having met them in life, Landon felt enveloped by a love so deep that it seemed eternal. Among these figures were two children smiling sweetly at him. He didn't recognize them immediately, but he felt an inexplicable calm before them. Later he would discover that these children were his siblings, who had died before he was born, a story that his parents had never shared. But there they were, hugging him tenderly, as if they had waited for him for all eternity. At the center of all that splendor, a different figure appeared. His light was brighter, warmer, and more intense than anything else in that place. Even without having seen it before, Landon knew instantly who it was. It was Jesus. The recognition was immediate, and with it came a wave of love so overwhelming that Landon could not hold back his tears. Jesus did not look at him with judgment, but with a compassion and tenderness that dispelled any trace of fear or pain. No words were spoken, but a clear and deep message was transmitted directly to his soul. Jesus told him that his trip there was not over yet. "It's not your time," Jesus said in a silence that echoed in the soul. "You have a mission." He must return to share what he saw, to remind the world that heaven is real, that life does not end with death, and that each person has a divine purpose. Despite not wanting to leave that place of perfection and love, Landon understood the importance of his mission. "I knew I needed to go back, even if it meant returning to a world marked by pain and suffering. It was a sacrifice, but also a major call." Suddenly, he felt an invisible force pulling him back. He was thrown through a tunnel of light and heat, and then opened his eyes. The cold and artificial light of the hospital room replaced the heavenly glow. I was back. The medical team was surprised to witness the impossible. After being pronounced dead 3 times, Landon was not only alive, but conscious. Tests were carried out immediately. They looked for signs of brain damage, memory loss, any sign of compromise, but found nothing. Against all odds, Landon was fully recovered. When he shook Julie's hand, her mother broke down into tears. It was a miracle, but she still didn't know the whole truth. Landon had not only survived, he had returned from a place that few know, with a message that would change lives forever. His son had returned intact. It was a miracle that no one could explain. However, the real impact came when Landon started talking. At first, his voice was a mere whisper, weakened by the long period in a coma. But every word that came out of his mouth brought an inexplicable force, which seemed to transcend his age. He described a place that seemed out of a dream, golden paths, a light that did not come from any sun, and a peace so deep that it surpassed any human understanding. What really left Julie paralyzed was when she mentioned 2 children who had received him with smiles full of love. He described them in detail, as if he knew them intimately, as if they were part of his whole life. But that was impossible. No one had ever told her about the 2 babies Julie had lost before her birth. It was a secret that he had kept in the deepest silence, buried along with his pain. There was, however, his son, detailing the appearance and warmth of the brothers he had never met in this world. His certainty was undeniable, and his words pulled tears from Julie's heart. The doctors and nurses who listened to him were perplexed. They had already witnessed accounts of near-death experiences, but never something so specific, so profound. Landon not only described a heavenly kingdom, but talked about people in details that no one in that hospital knew. That defied all logic. Julie lived a whirlwind of emotions. Her heart was filled with gratitude for having her son back, but the pain of the loss of her husband was still an open wound. Even so, I knew that something extraordinary had happened. In the following days, Landon recovered at a pace that surprised the doctors. Not only did his body seem to heal quickly, but his mind was also clearer and sharper than ever. However, what impressed everyone around him the most was the change in his soul. Before the accident, Landon was a curious and energetic child, but now there was something different about him. He carried a serenity and wisdom that did not belong to a child of his age. And then, with the same clarity with which he had described heaven, he began to talk about what Jesus had told him. "He told me that it was not my time," Landon explained, looking into Julie's eyes, as if he wanted to engrave his words in his soul. "He told me that I had to go back because my mission was to tell people that heaven is real, that life does not end here, and that each of us has a purpose." Julie listened with tears running down her face, feeling every word of him as a direct impact on her heart. It wasn't just what he said, but how he said. There was a weight, a truth, a strength in his voice that could not be ignored. Soon Landon's story began to spread, first between family and friends. Then he went further. People from everywhere began to look for him, looking for answers, comfort, or the hope that life would not end with death. "Heaven is a real place," said Landon with an unwavering conviction. "It is a place full of love, where we meet again with those we love." Jesus asked me to tell the world. Landon knew that his experience was a gift, but also a burden. He understood that he had returned not only to live, but to share what he had seen and felt. Not everyone believed in him. Some listened to him with skepticism, looking for scientific explanations for what he had described. Experts spoke of hallucinations caused by the lack of oxygen in the brain, chemical reactions during trauma, or even the imagination of a young mind trying to make sense of chaos. For these skeptics, the golden paths and angelic faces were just creations of a wounded brain. But Landon didn't let himself be shaken. He was not trying to convince anyone, just to fulfill the mission that had been entrusted to him. While sharing his experience, Landon seemed to be aware of the impact his words had. His voice was weak at first, but his message was clear and powerful. When he told his story for the first time, he was still lying in the hospital bed, his fragile body, but his strong soul. "Jesus told me that I had to go back, because it was not yet my time," he repeated, with a serenity that silenced any doubt. "He asked me to tell people that there is a purpose for all of us, and that death is not the end." Julie, listening to her son, felt an irreversible change in her heart. She didn't know why Landon had been chosen to receive such an important message, but she knew that nothing would be like before. Over time, Landon began to inspire not only those around him, but also people he had never met. The churches invited him to share his story. Entire congregations were in absolute silence, listening carefully to the words of this child who spoke with the certainty and clarity of someone much older. Although not all believed, many found comfort and hope in his testimony. For those who were lost in pain and despair, Landon offered something precious: the belief that love never dies, that lost connections can be restored, and that there is a purpose beyond this life. His story not only touched hearts, but illuminated roads. And Landon, with the wisdom of someone who had touched the divine, fulfilled his mission with humility, love, and a faith that never hesitated. Landon knew from an early age that his life would never be the same. He didn't just have a story to tell, but a new purpose: to live as a reflection of the love and light he had experienced. His mission was not to convince anyone, but to inspire, and he did it with a sincerity that deeply moved those who heard it. Julie, for her part, was consoled to see the impact that her son's words had on people. The pride he felt grew with each story of someone who had found hope in his testimony. Little by little, he began to see life from a new perspective, imagining Andy in that place of peace that Landon had described. His prayers, once marked by pain, became full of serenity, as if he could finally trust a greater purpose. "Heaven is real," said Landon, "and love never ends." As he grew up, he shared his message with simple words and meaningful gestures. His life, more than his story, became the true proof of what he had lived. In the end, Landon's story was not just about a boy who came back to life. It was about the power of love, the hope that goes beyond death, and the certainty that every moment of life has a purpose. And so, he went on with humility and faith, remembering all those who listened to him. Love never dies, and there is something much greater waiting for us.